1871. A great metropolis in the making, but a metropolis with a fatal flaw.
A simple barn fire turned the city into a cauldron of smoke and ash.
In one night, a city of wood turned to a city of cinders.
It was utter pandemonium, a sea of teeming masses.
Were Mrs. O'Leary's cow and her lantern really to blame? Or did the true culprit escape?
Does he want to be responsible for burning down 3 1/3 square miles of the heart of Chicago? No. I'm convinced it was definitely Daniel Pigleg Sullivan.
Now, we rebuild the neighborhood that spawned the blaze.
So what we're seeing here, Dick, is a overhead view of DeKoven Street.
Search for hidden clues.
And we have flame.
Relight the fire that consumed a city. And ask the question, could what happened in Chicago happen again?
All of the elements that were present in Chicago in 1871 are still with us today.
On Unsolved History. October 2003. Fires scorched Southern California. 3,500 homes wiped out. 750,000 acres of forest gone. 24 people dead. Battalion Chief Dave Chovanec spent 2 weeks risking his life on the fire line.
It's the worst fire that I've ever seen. We had not only dry brush because of the drought, but our biggest enemy was the wind out of the east pushing that fire into homes. Well, we were concerned that the fire would continue to move through the city. Finally, the wind stopped and we were able to get a handle on the situation.
Los Angeles was saved. This time, 130 years earlier, another American city was not so lucky. Chicago's turn came sometime around 9 o'clock on Sunday evening, October 8, 1871. 24 hours later, the flames had destroyed roughly 3 1/3 square miles of the city. Movie recreations of the horror Chicago suffered don't come close to the grim reality. The damage totaled $3 billion in today's dollars. 300 people were dead. 100,000 were left homeless.
There are a lot of similarities between the Chicago fire and our recent fires in Southern California. We were right in the middle of a drought. They were in a drought. And we had high winds that pushed the fire out of control.
Fires destroyed old Chicago. But it was a close call. Questions about a fire that took place 130 years ago now burn stronger than ever.
There's an urgency into finding out what the key factors were that could have turned a major calamity into a total catastrophe.
To uncover the clues buried in the rubble of old Chicago, Unsolved History has assembled a team of high-powered investigators. Battalion Chief Dave Chovanec. Arson investigator John DeHaan. Author Richard Bales. David Lewis, fire historian. And fire behavioral specialist Doug Campbell. Our investigation will focus first on establishing a basic timeline for the fire, the anatomy of an incendiary catastrophe. In the summer of 1871, Illinois experienced a terrible drought. Between July 4th and October 8th, just 1.5 inches of rain fell. A warm wind from the southwest dried the city out even more. 19th century Chicago was made of wood, with huge stockpiles of coal, lumber, and grain. In other words, a giant tinderbox just waiting for a spark. That came shortly after 9 p.m. in the barn of Catherine and Patrick O'Leary. The blaze spread quickly, following the wind in a northeasterly direction. the fire department struggled to control a sea of flames already too hot to approach.
Literally an hour after the fire had started, the flames had gotten so intense, the fire leapfrogged 6 blocks north towards the river. It became a sea of fire, literally a wall of flames.
The wind blew so hard, it spawned tornadoes of flame and debris. Tornadoes that hurled the fire clear across city blocks and across Chicago's only natural fire break, the river.
By midnight, Sunday night, the fire gained in intensity. It was racing through downtown, and there was literally no stopping it. Thousands of people were thrown into the streets. It was a sea of humanity, all ages, all classes, racing the flames.
In the early hours of Monday morning, the city's water pumping station caught fire. Chicago's fire department was out of water, but the inferno marched on, northward.
Early Monday morning, the courthouse caught fire. About 2 a.m., the bell, which had been set to ring continuously through the night, fell down to the basement with a thundering crash, thus signaling the end of Chicago, the destruction of a city.
Thousands of residents took refuge on the shores of Lake Michigan. Then, nature relented. At 11 p.m. on Monday night, after months of drought, rain finally came. The fire began to fizzle, and the search for a culprit began. On December 12, 1871, Chicago's Board of Police and Fire Commissioners announced they could find no actual cause. But folklore tells this story.
Good morning, boys and girls.
Good morning, Mrs. Connolly.
When you think about the Chicago fire, what is one name that always comes to mind? Yes.
Mrs. O'Leary.
The final chapter in the saga of the Great Chicago Fire is opened at the home of Mrs. O'Leary, whose legendary cow is presumed to have started the whole thing.
On October 8th, Catherine O'Leary received a late-night customer for milk. She went to the barn to fill the order and left without the lantern. Soon after, her cow kicked it over, and it became the seat of an inferno that destroyed Chicago. News reporters claim they found the lantern in the rubble, and the legend began. But is legend correct? Was Mrs. O'Leary really to blame?
Mrs. O'Leary.
Nancy Knight Connolly is Catherine O'Leary's great-great-granddaughter. She does not believe the legend.
When we were children, our grandmother told us the story about Mrs. O'Leary, and she told us that in no way was her grandmother responsible for the fire.
This is the way the O'Leary family remembers that night.
Mrs. O'Leary and the whole entire family had been in bed, asleep, and they were awakened around 8:45 by one of the neighbors who said that their barn was on fire.
The O'Learys woke up to find their barn already ablaze. If someone had been in the barn, it wasn't one of the O'Learys. Their suspicions turned to a neighbor, Daniel Sullivan, a man they called Pegleg, who kept a cow in their barn.
The neighbors think that he was asked to go out to the barn to get something, and when he went out there, that's when it happened.
Was pipe-smoking Sullivan the true culprit?
But when I think back to poor Mrs. O'Leary, her whole life since that fire was really ruined.
Richard Bales also believes Mrs. O'Leary was innocent. He has spent the last 7 years analyzing original testimonies and pre-fire land records.
These are considered the official public record of land conveyances prior to the Chicago fire.
See, Marty, what I want to do here, I want to determine who owned what on October 8, 1871, and then put it in its geographical perspective, and then finally draw my own map of the O'Leary neighborhood.
At the Chicago Land Title Office, Bales reconstructed the exact plots of land in the O'Leary neighborhood.
Through this inquiry testimony, here's the infamous O'Leary barn there, as well as the Dalton shed.
In November and December of 1871, Daniel Pegleg Sullivan testified to the official investigation that he visited with the O'Learys, then walked across to Coven Street and sat in front of William White's home.
While sitting there, he claimed he saw fire break out in the O'Leary barn. He ran across to Coven Street yelling, "Fire, fire," as loud as he could, tried to rescue the animals, could only rescue a calf and a cow before he was beaten back by the flames.
But as Bales examined this testimony and compared it with the lay of the land, he saw a striking inconsistency.
He testified that he saw the fire break out in the lower portion of the east side of the barn. So for him to see the glow of the fire breaking out through the side of the barn would have meant that the fire would have been burning inside the barn for quite some time.
Either that, or Peg Leg suddenly grew 25 feet tall. Richard Bales is certain that Peg Leg lied, but the question remains, is he guilty? Some suggest no person was to blame, that an ember from a neighbor's chimney, or even spontaneous combustion was the cause. What's needed is hard evidence, evidence that no longer exists. To discover what really caused the Great Chicago Fire, Unsolved History must rebuild the O'Leary barn exactly. Plant its own evidence, and put it to the torch. October 2003. Nature flexes her muscles in California. October 1871. It was Chicago's turn to feel the heat. For over a century, Catherine O'Leary and her cow have borne the blame for starting the fire that destroyed more property than any other in American history. While the link between the O'Leary barn fire and the devastation of Chicago is irrefutable, no one made any forensic study of the barn's remains to find out precisely what started the blaze. No one, that is, until Unsolved History brought in a team of modern-day arson investigators. John DeHaan and Dave Chovanec are on the trail of evidence that the original investigation may have missed. Will they find the lantern, the evidence that fingered Mrs. O'Leary? Or will there be other clues that might point the finger at someone or something else? We began by constructing an exact replica of the O'Leary barn. It was a simple wooden shack, 23 by 16 feet and nearly 14 feet high. In the loft, there were 2 tons of hay. Outside, a shed filled with coal. It was a microcosm of 1871 Chicago, a city on the verge of igniting.
You know, John, looking around, it looks fairly obvious, but why is this barn so combustible?
At this point, everything in the barn would be combustible, the dry hay and the dry exposed wood. And given the conditions prior to the fire, the long drought, the high temperatures, the high winds, that takes all the moisture and humidity out, makes them not only easily ignitable, but able to support extremely rapid flame spread.
If I took you back to 1871 and you looked at this place after the fire had already passed through, what would you be looking for and what would it tell you?
We'd start by looking for a general area of origin and then narrowing it down to a point of origin. In that point of origin, we'd expect to find an ignition source and the material first ignited, and then watch it burn and go from there.
Here in Camarillo, California, the humidity and temperature are nearly identical to those of that fateful October night. While the winds were here in force this October, today they're gone. Chicago's fire was driven by a strong wind from the southwest. But Unsolved History has arranged for that. Battalion Chief Dave Chovanec matches the artificial wind speed to that blowing on October 8, 1871, 20 miles per hour from the southwest.
Looks like right about there.
First, Camarillo Fire Captain Brian Bulger plants some possible sources of ignition.
One of the first items will be a match that may have been discarded during the fire. Second will be a tobacco pipe that's ignited.
These are the smoking materials that neighbor Peg Leg Sullivan may have left in the barn.
And last, we have a lantern, very typical for lighting.
This lamp is typical of the period and should closely match the one Mrs. O'Leary would have used. And it's what Captain Bulger uses. But Unsolved History's experts will have to discover that for themselves.
So what do we have right now?
Our expert team will not only look for the source of the fire. Using modern forensic tools, they will attempt to discover how it burned out of control so quickly. You are about to witness the genesis of one of the greatest calamities in American history.
We're seeing heat radiate against the walls, and you'll start to see the sidewalls ignite. In fact, you can see it as we move over here.
Blackened over there. We already have penetration through the wall.
And of course, we have the wind blowing from the north-northeast, just like it did October 8, 1871. Notice how the fire is breaking through the east wall, which is exactly what Daniel Sullivan said when he testified at the inquiry.
Pegleg Sullivan claimed that when he tried to put out the fire, it was burning on the east side of the barn. Our barn has reached this stage after just 5 minutes.
You can see it right here. Look at that coming out.
That means that the radiant heat is going to ignite the side of the shed very quickly.
After just 7 minutes, the wind rushing through the barn's open doors has driven the fire to completely engulf the north wall.
The wind is actually protecting this fuel by cooling it and forcing the fire back and the radiant heat back towards the back of the barn.
Until now, the fire has remained contained to the barn's east wall. But at the 10-minute mark, this happens.
We should back off a little. Now, Dave, what kind of temperatures are we seeing in there?
Way above 2,000, would you say, John?
Yeah, extremely well ventilated wood fire, capable of producing temperatures in excess of 2,000. We've measured as high as 2,200. In fact, under these kinds of conditions, prolonged, you can melt cast iron, which melts at about 2,500 Fahrenheit.
For historian Richard Bales, this burning barn is graphic evidence of why the fire department could not control the blaze.
They figured that the fire department didn't get to the barn, didn't even see the fire until the fire had been started for 5 minutes.
When the Chicago Fire Department arrived, this is what they were confronted with. A barn that could not be saved, and a neighboring property that had already caught fire.
Maybe that's why the fire department still felt they could have put the fire out when they first got here, because at this point in time, the Dalton house possibly had not yet caught fire.
The fire department saved the O'Leary's house to the barn's south, but they were unable to stop the blaze from jumping to the neighbors to the north and west sides. Within 20 minutes, this fire is so big, it's creating its own weather system. A convection whirl is a firefighter's worst enemy, a wild tornado of fire.
We got one.
Look at that.
We got it.
Look at that.
Whirl. There you go.
The air that can't find its balance, so it's sucking in air and it's twirling around. So we'll see that. That helps carry that thermal column higher.
Right.
And sends brands way, way up.
25 minutes after the barn fire began,
There goes the hay. There's the log.
the O'Leary barn is just a skeleton. And the fire must move on to find fresh fuel. With the flames doused, we're ready to put our crack team of arson investigators to the test. Can they track down the cause of the blaze in these smoldering remains? Can 21st century technology reveal exactly what happened in Chicago in October of 1871?
On the next
Unsolved History's pyrotechnic investigation into the fire that torched Chicago is heating up. Our exact replica of the barn where the Great Blaze started burned to the ground in just 25 minutes. A timeline that matches the demise of Mrs. O'Leary's 19th century property. Now, while the embers are still cooling, our 21st century investigators are ready to examine the scene.
John, what do you see on this fence that tells us the story?
Well, this is a good example of a kind of indicator we'd use to help us establish the direction of fire spread. And you can see out here the paint on the fence is undamaged.
Yeah.
Here the paint is beginning to scorch. Here it's well scorched. Here the paint is burned away and the wood beneath it is charred. And the further we get to the left, the more and more intense the damage.
Our fire spread in the direction of the prevailing wind, toward the northeast, igniting the fence of the adjacent property, just as the Chicago fire did.
This fence is very important because the fire traveled from this fence to the Dalton house and eventually set his house on fire.
Are you telling me that this fire somewhat duplicated the historical evidence?
This fire very much duplicated historical evidence. It started on the lower east end of the barn and then traveled along the fence.
Our experts are satisfied that this fire was a genuine reproduction of the original event.
Burned in the fire and...
Now, their job is to try to discover what Captain Bulger used to set this blaze.
And we find the remains of a lantern. Along with that, we can see the glass that has taken some heat damage to it. This is more of a general area of origin, so it is a possible ignition source.
Arson expert Dave Chovanec locates our fire's origin in less than a minute. The reproduction 19th century lantern. But historian Richard Bales immediately notices something of profound historical significance.
I think it's most important from a historical standpoint is that this glass appears to be melted just like the window glass over there. Mm-hmm. People after the fire claimed that they found pieces of the lamp in the fire, but these pieces of lamp were almost pristine, unlike the melted glass here.
Mrs. O'Leary testified at the inquiry that she had left no lantern in the barn, but in the days after the fire, several people came forward, claiming they had found remains of one in the smoldering ruins, well-preserved remains.
The possibility that they may have been lying, that they really did indeed find no lamp in the fire.
No matter whether this lantern was at the source of the blaze or tucked away in a corner of the barn, it could not have resisted the 2,000-degree heat that our infrared imager recorded across the whole barn. If we can't believe what witnesses tell us about finding Mrs. O'Leary's lantern, then how can we trust their conclusions that Mrs. O'Leary started the fire?
We have interviews that are inconsistent with the physical findings, and we've shown that today. So there's something wrong with their story. Either they didn't remember it or they changed it to cover up something that happened.
Thanks to these witness statements, Mrs. O'Leary was convicted in the court of public opinion. But unsolved history has shown that the evidence that led to the conviction of Mrs. O'Leary must have been false. If a lantern was found in the O'Leary's barn, its glass would surely have been melted. But what about the other possible culprits? What about Pegleg Sullivan's pipe-in match? Our investigators found no remains of either. These wooden objects were vaporized in the blaze. No evidence could have directly pointed to Pegleg. But could the fire have been caused not by human error, but by a freak of nature? Some historians of the Chicago fire suggest that the green hay in the barn loft may have spontaneously combusted. Spontaneous combustion is driven by microorganisms. As they decompose the hay, the temperature rises. Despite the dry conditions, was the hay in the O'Leary barn moist enough to set fire to itself?
If the hay's too dry, it doesn't work. And if the hay's way too wet, it doesn't work.
However unlikely, this scenario is still possible and must be put to the test. Because it takes hay 4 to 6 weeks to spontaneously combust, John DeHaan has created an accelerated alternative. Replacing hay with linseed oil and cloth mimics the biochemical process precisely, but in a matter of hours, not weeks.
We're about 3 hours into the test, and the temperature in the middle of the bucket's 137 Fahrenheit.
John and Dave Chovanec are closely monitoring the temperature inside the bucket. At around 340 degrees, the combustion should occur.
You may see some smoke, some of the aldehydes cooking off, and that's when the temperature will start to get even more dramatic.
After 4 hours, our thermal camera clearly picks up the heat in the bucket.
Is white.
We may be at a critical stage here now with temperatures over 300 degrees.
After more than 5 hours, flames seem close at hand.
We're getting visible smoke. That's a good sign. Temperature inside the mass is rapidly increasing, a couple of degrees a minute, and so is the temperature at the bottom. You can see a lot more smoke coming off. And we have flame. Excellent. We have ignition.
After 5 hours and 45 minutes, our arson experts have triggered spontaneous combustion, an event that would have taken over a month with green hay. But a close look at the timeline actually shows that spontaneous combustion could not have caused the fire in the O'Leary barn. During the last few minutes of our test, the mass of cloth and oil produced a great quantity of smoke. Those minutes in our compressed timeline correspond to around 6 hours for the green hay in the O'Leary barn. During those 6 hours, the smell of smoke would have alerted anyone who entered the barn.
So the chance of spontaneous ignition as the source of our fire in the O'Leary barn is very, very slim.
But there's still another possibility. Could a stray ember from a nearby chimney have sparked the barn fire, which in turn destroyed the city? In 19th century Chicago, cooking would have been finished soon after sunset. Who could have had a fire still burning at 9 p.m. on such a hot night? Perhaps a neighbor. On that same night, the McLaughlins were celebrating the arrival of their cousin from Ireland.
Some of the first books published after the fire, as early as 1872, started to pose some rival explanations to the cow theory. They brought up the McLaughlins party that was going on that night, and they cite the tinder-dry conditions of the city.
Pegleg claimed that he heard violin music when he walked by their house on his way to smoke his pipe. The O'Leary barn was just 70 feet away from the McLaughlins' house, directly downwind. Could a burning ember have jumped this gap? For Dave Chovanec, this is a crucial scenario to explore.
I always suspect embers. This is the #1 cause for fire spreading. Embers get up into the wind, are pushed down into ignitable material, and cause conflagrations.
Unsolved History's fire investigators will put this theory to the test. On each target, there are 3 separate sources of ignitable materials: a pile of straw, swatches of cotton fabric, and wood shavings. The targets are stationed every 5 feet for a distance of 50 feet. Dave Chovanec checks the wind speed with his anemometer.
Okay. Very good, and we're at 20 miles an hour at this distance right here.
Our infrared cameras will capture how far embers can travel and still sustain enough heat to ignite a fire. Could a single ember burn down a barn, or even worse, start a conflagration?
You can see embers landing randomly all over the place.
We have ignition in the wood shavings at 15 feet. The wood shavings are significant because they were given free to people as fuel.
With wind speeds not even 20 miles per hour, burning embers are landing up to 50 feet away.
We're seeing embers as far as 40 and 50 feet. Nothing has lit so far down here past the 25-foot. We're at about 18 miles an hour here. We'll kick it up just a little bit more. And again, we're getting, yes, hot embers from 20 also. Moving down, we've got ignition in 30. We've got ignition in 35. Shavings in 30.
Oh, yeah. Shavings? Good.
40. So even with just these little squares, we're seeing fires start all over the place.
In 19th century Chicago, nearly every home had livestock, stables, hay, and wood shavings, all of which our experiment has shown are highly flammable.
And look, even at 50.
We have ignition at 50 feet. That's great, in the wood shavings. And in the straw at 45 feet.
45, so this whole strip.
A windblown spark could well have traveled 70 feet before dying out. The McLaughlins testified that they were through with cooking dinner by 8 p.m. But how good was their memory? And how strong was their motive to tell the truth? In a matter of hours, a simple barn fire had engulfed much of Chicago. How did the fire get so big so fast? We're about to explore the true nature of fire, to find out how its hungry flames devoured a city.
From the net.
Chicago would not be the architectural wonder it is today were it not for one calamitous night. The Great Fire of 1871 erased old downtown from the map and scorched one woman's name into history. But Unsolved History's investigation has cast doubt on her guilt. We've shown that Catherine O'Leary's lantern could not have been found intact in the remains of her barn, as witnesses who blamed her claim. Our tests have shown that the fire was not caused by spontaneous combustion of hay. Our experts have demonstrated, however, that the blaze could have been sparked by an ember from a neighbor's chimney, blown on the wind. But how did that wind spread the fire so far, so fast, to make it leap from the O'Leary barn, cross 2 rivers, and destroy an entire city? Why was Los Angeles saved in 2003? And Chicago lost in 1871.
What's important about trying to contain a fire is getting a lot of resources there very early, and this helps the fire from spreading into a major disaster.
Did the fire department fail Chicago that night? During that first week of October, the city suffered 28 separate fires. On the night of October 7th, a huge blaze at a lumber mill kept the city's firemen busy all night, and through the following afternoon. The firemen had put all these blazes out, but on October 8th, it was different.
Firefighters in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 had fought a fire the night before and were exhausted. They'd been up all night, in fact, into the next day, got back into quarters at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then they were called out again at 9 p.m. to respond to the Great Chicago Fire.
A fire that began at 9 p.m. was out of control by 10 and was soon lapping at the banks of the Chicago River.
As the flames raced towards downtown business district, it had become a conflagration. One firefighter described it as nothing but fire overhead. There was no clouds, no stars, nothing but fire.
Around midnight, embers blew across the narrow south branch of the Chicago River and set downtown ablaze. By 2 a.m., it had approached Chicago's biggest natural fire break, the wide branch of the Chicago River that flows into Lake Michigan.
It was utter pandemonium. There were people, animals, horses, wagons. Everything was chock-a-block, wall-to-wall, a sea of teeming masses.
It just strikes me that this was this lifeline. All of these bridges appear to be like arteries of safety to the other side.
They indeed were. This was one of the means of escape. Nobody really thought that the fire was going to jump the river. So they thought by reaching to the northern side, they were going to be safe.
But they were not. In what witnesses reported as the most remarkable event of the night, a tornado of fire jumped clean from one side of the river to the other. This phenomenon is known as a convection whirl.
Convection whirls are one of the most frightening things for a firefighter. They can jump hundreds of feet, spreading the fire across roads, and in the case of the Great Chicago Fire, moving the fire across the river.
They have been known to jump entire freeways, but the size of the jump that must have taken place in Chicago has always astounded fire experts. How could a fire have propelled itself over a span of nearly 300 feet? Fire behavior specialist Doug Campbell has studied the phenomenon of convection whirls for over 30 years. Here's his low-tech demonstration of how fire takes on a life of its own.
We'll start by lighting a line of fire, which would be like one side of a building burning through the other side or in the forest. Then as it transitions and you light an area on fire by maybe spot fires occurring, you start to get area on fire, what I call fire on fire. And as you can see, the intensity increases by at least 10 and maybe 15, and you start to get the properties of a fire whirl. All the little flames are pulling in and also getting a rotation, so this is creating its own indraft.
During Unsolved History's burn of the O'Leary barn replica, a small convection whirl formed.
Got one. Look at that. We got him. Look at that. Whoa, there you go.
Convection whirls occur because once a fire gets big enough, it starts to form its own weather, creating a giant updraft, not unlike a tornado.
We're starting to see the heat causing a convective rise. The wind is fueling the fire with oxygen, and convective rise starting to generate a fire whirl.
These convection whirls are devastating.
No way to predict its path, no way to predict its travel. The only thing to do is to get out of its way. There's no way to stop it.
The Chicago fire swept over an area of 25 acres every 10 minutes, 100 homes a minute, 3,000 acres of buildings ruined in just 18 hours. And to crown this frightening demonstration of nature's supremacy over man, a column of fire jumped more than 270 feet, ensuring the destruction of an American city. Our investigation has brought us closer to understanding just what caused the Chicago fire to grow into such a devastating conflagration. But one mystery is still unsolved. Every fire must start with a spark. And for historian Richard Bales, there is still a nagging question. Precisely what role did the O'Leary's neighbor, Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, play?
You wonder even now if Sullivan could have seen the flames. So granted, he certainly would have seen a lot of smoke by now, but he testified he saw the flames.
Pegleg was the first man to see the fire. Any arson investigator will tell you that the person who first sees the fire is the #1 suspect. And Richard Bales is sure that when Pegleg testified to the Board of Inquiry, he lied about seeing the flames from outside the barn.
I think that after visiting with the O'Learys, he went directly to the O'Leary barn. Maybe he just wanted to sit there for a little bit. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his peg leg was bothering him. Could have been a pipe. Maybe he lit a match or something, but somehow the fire started.
Richard Bales feels that after seeing the damage the fire caused, Pegleg needed to come up with an alibi. He didn't want to be responsible for burning down 3 1/3 square miles of the heart of Chicago.
He needed to invent a story. I'm convinced it was definitely Daniel Pegleg Sullivan.
Unsolved History decided to put Richard Bales' theory to the test. To recreate the streets of Chicago and walk the frenzied trek Pegleg claimed he made in his testimony. To discover if the Chicago fire was started by a stray wind-blown ember or by a careless human hand. Unsolved History's investigation to uncover the origins of the Great Chicago Fire has come down to the word of one key witness, Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, the only man who claimed he was inside the burning barn. According to his testimony, he saw the fire in the barn roof while he was sitting across the street, and that he rushed over to try to rescue the animals, including the cow he kept there. The question is, did he really get to the barn after the fire had already begun to rage? Or was he there the very moment it sprung into life? Our investigators will now examine his testimony, using a reconstruction of the actual plots of land around the O'Leary barn in 1871.
At about 8 o'clock, Daniel Sullivan, who lived about here on the south side of DeKalb Street, said that he visited with the O'Learys, who lived right there.
So what we're seeing here, Dick, is an overhead view of DeKalb Street with Sullivan standing in front of the white fence.
From the geometry of the street plan, we can determine the minimum distance Pegleg had to travel to get from DeKalb Street to the barn.
We know that Sullivan would have had to have run 193 feet from his position in front of William White's home along this fence to the O'Leary barn.
What we have to determine is whether from the moment he first saw the fire, could Pegleg have made it to the barn before it was engulfed in flames. Richard Bales's recreation of the O'Leary neighborhood has already shown that in order for Pegleg to have seen the fire, it must have been burning high above the roof. Thanks to our barn burn experiment, we can identify that moment. See how much time passes before the barn is engulfed in flame, and compare that with the journey Pegleg Sullivan had to make.
Right now, we are sitting where we think is that exact location.
And of course, this would be this elevated wooden sidewalk and a dirt road, dirt street, 60 feet wide, wouldn't it?
Sure, now it's pavement, but back then it was a rough, earthen street, hampered by his wooden leg. He would have been traveling not even as fast as we're traveling now.
Just 20 seconds after the barn fire would have been visible to Pegleg, roaring flames would have made entering the barn impossible. In those same 20 seconds, our investigators, walking at a brisk pace, only made it halfway to the barn. History records that Pegleg managed to rescue a cow from the blaze. To get to the barn and untie a large animal must have taken at least a minute.
The demonstrations of Pegleg Sullivan's reported trip back to the barn, that certainly throws his other statements into great doubt.
Perhaps what went on in the barn is more like this. Unsolved History found out how hard it is to put out a fire that starts in dry hay.
Are we going?
Fire in the hole, yes.
Fire in the hole. Okay.
By accident.
I didn't know, we're not quite ready. Can we stop that?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
Luckily, our cameras were rolling.
Robert, get up there, run!
And today, as in 1871, there's only one possible outcome. If Pegleg did accidentally drop a match in bone-dry hay, that barn was history. But there is one other scenario, one that could clear Pegleg's name. If the fire was caused by an ember blowing from a neighbor's chimney, the barn roof could well have caught fire first.
If an ember had found its way into the barn, into the loft, into some ignitable material, it could have been the source of our fire.
If this is what happened, Pegleg could have seen the fire burning on the roof and still have had time to enter the barn's ground floor, which might still have been free of flames.
I think it's a bit of a stretch to finger Pegleg Sullivan as the culprit who started the fire. Certainly there are a lot of holes in his testimony. But if Pegleg was telling the truth, the fire would have had to have started from some other means.
Precisely what those means were, we will probably never know. Unsolved History's investigation has uncovered one certain truth about the family whose name is forever linked with Chicago's Great Fire.
All the witnesses reported that when they did bang on the O'Leary's door, everybody was in the house and accounted for. So I think given the rapidity with which a fire like this would spread, the time frame means that you can eliminate all of the O'Learys as possible origin.
In his recollections, fire insurance man Robert S. Critchell claims that Mrs. O'Leary admitted that she had gone out to milk the cow for a late-night customer. This is the moment where folklore assumes Mrs. O'Leary left her lantern behind.
The whole lantern theory doesn't make much sense. It was dark in 1871, no streetlights in this neighborhood, of course. There was a small, waning crescent moon that night, and it is doubtful that Mrs. O'Leary would have been able to walk back from the house to the barn that night in the dark, having left the lantern behind.
On October 8, 1871, most of Chicago was turned to ashes. Those ashes are now buried underneath millions of tons of concrete that made modern Chicago. Whether that night of devastation was sparked by the hand of nature or of man, we'll never know. But we do know once nature took over, there was no saving Chicago. And that 130 years later, the wrong set of circumstances could still doom America's booming metropolises.
All of the elements that were present in Chicago in 1871 are still with us today. We had high winds, we had an expanding city.
Later, the search is on for a missing woman on Evil